This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty, and this is episode number 3. The theme of tonight's episode is Travel as Education. Tonight we'll be speaking with 3 incredible travelers, each who have transformed their family's travels into an educational experience. First, Nancy and her husband and 2 sons spent 3 years cycling through the Americas, starting in Alaska and ending their adventure in Argentina. Nancy is a former school teacher and has written a book called Road Schooling, The Ultimate Guide to Education Through Travel, and we'll be talking to her about her book tonight. So welcome, Nancy.
Thanks, Lainey. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. And next on tonight's panel is Rainer. Rainer's a former National Geographic executive, who gave it all up to travel with his family around the world for a year. Having traveled to over 60 countries, Rainer is an authority on family travel and how it can be used as a learning tool. He has dedicated his life to bringing this message to the public through the Family Travel Association. So welcome, Rainer. I'm so happy to have you on the panel tonight.
Thank you, Lainey. Looking forward to chatting with everyone.
Wonderful. And finally, on tonight's panel, Greg joins us from Costa Rica to share his experiences traveling and living abroad as a family of 8. Since 2007, Greg and his family have traveled or lived in British Columbia, the Yukon, India, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Peru, Costa Rica, where he finally is. Greg and his wife, Rachel, world school their children, and Greg is an educational mentor for youth and adults, providing mentoring to further their educational and life goals in both group and one-on-one settings. So welcome, Greg. We're so happy to have you here tonight.
Thanks, Lainey. Excited to be here.
What an incredible panel, and I'm so excited to get started. So let's jump in with Nancy first. Nancy, could you share with us a little bit about your background and what led you to approaching travel as part of your children's education?
Boy, that one goes back a long, long, long way. When I was 16, my parents took me down to Mexico with my brother and sister, and we spent 3 weeks traveling around Mexico, and I learned so much during that time. My eyes were open to the idea that this big wide world existed out there, and I was fascinated with that whole idea. After that, we got home. I made the decision that I was going to be going in the Peace Corps, and that led to a life of living abroad and traveling extensively. I saw, for me personally, what a difference that travel made, and so I always knew that I wanted to have my children out in the world, exploring the world.
And Nancy, I think what makes your story rather fascinating is both you and your husband are either school teachers or former school teachers, and so you bring with your travels a real focus on the educational aspects. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays into your travels?
Absolutely. I think what that has done, as you mentioned, I taught for 21 years, my husband taught for 20. And I think what that experience in the classroom did, and not only the classroom experience, but also just the academic experience of taking classes and studying about education and about how we learn and about how, what happens inside our brain when we learn something. That background helped me tremendously in helping me understand that learning process, or what the learning process is, I guess, and that learning process doesn't have to happen in a classroom. There's nothing wrong with the classroom. I'm not anti-school by any stretch of the imagination, but learning happens everywhere, and we can take advantage of that everywhere. And so that background as a teacher, I think, gave me the confidence to know that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your introduction and your story with us. Let's move on now to Rainer. And same question for you, Rainer. My question is, could you share with us a little bit about your background and tell us what led you to approaching travel as a part of your children's education?
Sure, Lainey. Well, my background is, first I was born in Germany and lived there until I was 6. So being German gives you the automatic right to travel. It seems like every German is required to circumnavigate the world. So I guess it was just part of my heritage. But actually, I moved to the United States when I was 6 years old. And one thing I clearly remember growing up and going to grammar school here in the States was that whenever other children's parents traveled, they were home alone, or they didn't go with them. And we always went with our parents, with my parents, my sister and I. We wouldn't think of not being with them. And I remember I was struck by that. Like, gee, why wouldn't these other parents take their children with them? That's kind of odd. But in any event, my background is somewhat traditional in the sense that grew up, went to high school, graduated, went on to college, got the job, married the beautiful girl, got the house outside of New York City. And one thing that's interesting about Manhattan, or at least working in Manhattan, is that you're as excited to get out of there as you are to go in. And my wife and I actually started talking at times quite seriously about just giving it all up, packing our suitcase, putting our careers and possessions in storage, and just travel around the world. And what a great kind of fantasy that would be. Of course, we never acted on it because there's always some rational reason why you shouldn't. And interestingly, it wasn't until the kids were born, and they were actually about 4 and 7 years old, that we kind of came up with the idea again, or at least we brought it up because we had not talked about it for quite some time. And we said, hey, wouldn't it be neat to be able to travel around the world, but with our kids, so that their foundation for their lives, for their future, would be this incredible experience. And it just seemed very natural for us. And it was actually, in some ways, a very easy decision to do it. And so we did. I should also preface it by saying that I worked for National Geographic for 13 years. I was publisher of their children's magazine, National Geographic Kids, which I'm proud to say is now the largest and most widely distributed magazine for children in the world. So having met the likes of, Johann Reinhardt and Nick Nichols, who's a photographer, and, the list kind of goes on, Jane Goodall, et cetera, you get pretty inspired, and you look at the world with a whole new sense of curiosity and wonderment that National Geographic is so famous for. But when you work there every day, you really get it in your blood. So travel seemed like a terrific way to expose the children to the fact that the world doesn't just revolve around the United States. And that was really the primary motivation, was to expose them to the entire landscape of different opportunities and possibilities and cultures. So, textbooks teach that, I think, certainly in an academic way, but to really have that hit home, I think, experiencing it firsthand, to us anyway, seemed like a very logical step. And I'll end with one kind of quote that Keith Bellows, who's the editor-in-chief of National Geographic Traveler, has written about and told me specifically. He said, learning happens not just between the ears, but between the poles. And I thought that was just it's a great quote, and I use it all the time. So thank you, Keith Bellows. But anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. So
Awesome. That's a great story. And actually, a little bit later on in the show, we're going to talk about what learning means to each person, because I'm sure as I started to travel, the definition of learning and education changed. It changed over time. And I understand that the inspiration to expose your children to other cultures is probably the first inspiring, that's your point of entry. But I think much more happens as we travel. So we're gonna swing back around to that throughout the show. So thank you, Rainer, for sharing your experiences with us.
Sure.
Let's move on to Greg. Greg, why don't you go ahead and share with us a little bit about your background and let us know how you discovered that travel and education were synonymous.
Yeah, I grew up in poverty in a broken home, and I literally remember one trip, and it was Yellowstone, and it was like, epic, man! I left my neighborhood. It was awesome, but that's all I remember. And then after high school, I had a chance to go to Peru, and I spent a couple years in Peru, and that for me was life changing. And like Rainer said, you get out of the U.S., you get out of your culture, you get out of what you know, and you're like, whoa, there's another world and another culture and another way to live and another language, and all this growth and all these ideas and all these incredible things started to happen. And it was just, you're like this high of growing and learning and expanding. But Peru was pretty rough. Peru was rough back when I was there. And in fact, we were there just last week, and I was blown away how much has changed. Just love that place. Absolutely love that place. But it was pretty rough back then. So I went back, went to school, got married, and we had kids. And that was my only association outside the country. I thought, well, I don't know if I dare take my kids out there. And so we kind of settled into life, and then had an opportunity to go to Guatemala on a backpacking trip, and then back to Peru on a humanitarian trip with some youth. And again, just relit that fire. I went home, I grabbed Rachel, I said, we got to go to Mexico. We went down there, and it just started that ball rolling, and it lit fire. We couldn't stop it. And so in 2007, we packed up all our bags and our kids. We did what Rainer was talking about. We sold everything, liquidated everything, packed up our then 4 kids, and we drove down the Pan American Highway and went and lived in Costa Rica. And since then, it has just been a wild adventure. We have 6 children now. 5th was born in Alaska. 6th was born here in Costa Rica last year, and we're just out to explore the world, and we're in for the long term. We just love being nomadic and going to new countries and places, experiencing what they have to offer without expectations, taking in, learning, enjoying, having the adventure, and then also trying to do some good while we're there, leave the world a little better place for having been there.
I love your story, and I've followed your stories for years. So, I've read your blog, and I've watched your family grow, and it's absolutely incredible. I put together this panel because I really wanted different perspectives. And we've got 2 people on the panel that are travelers that traveled for a very specific time. Rainer and his family traveled for a year. Nancy and her family traveled based on an adventure, not on the time frame. They had an estimate of how much time it would take them to get from Alaska to Ushuaia, Argentina. And so, but it was a specific time based on an activity. Now, Greg, tell me about you and your family's plan. It's difficult for people to comprehend that it's an open-ended plan. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, it is really unique. It's very unconventional and sometimes seems quite crazy. And I don't know that we even planned it. It's just kind of evolved into that. We'd gone out and wanted to experience it, enjoy it. But now we've grown to love it, and we've created and crafted and designed our life around it. And so it's indefinite. We'll have a home base somewhere where we come back to, but we love to go out. So we, like I said, we were in Peru last week. We'll be in Costa Rica for a couple months, and we're heading to Spain, Portugal, France. We're going to spend some time in Morocco in Africa, go through Egypt and Israel into Eastern Europe. And then, in the future, our plans kind of change and morph as we go, but we want to do all of South America, of course. and hit every country down there and drive that whole thing. So we actually met Nancy in Boise when we were coming through driving from Alaska. Stopped at Nancy's house, had a great time, and people thought we were crazy, and we're like, no, we have friends that rode their bikes. And it was just wonderful. And so we made it to Costa Rica and to Panama, and then we're going to come back and finish that trip, do all South America, get down to Ushuaia.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I will continue to follow you on your blog for sure. We'll share all that information at the end of the show. I want to jump over to Nancy next and ask you, Nancy, if you could share a little bit about your adventure. Can you describe the adventure and let us know what the experience was like for you?
Describe the adventure. Oh gosh, how do you do that in just a few words? We spent, our boys are twins, and so when they were in third grade, we spent their third grade year cycling around the U.S. and Mexico. And that was like Rainer's experience. That was a one-year thing. We were just going to take a year, go out, travel around America and Mexico, and then come back home. And we figured we would come back home and just jump right back into normal life. That one-year trip ended up being a springboard for a huge life change for us. And we made the decision on that one-year trip that we wanted to ride from Alaska to Argentina. And so we came back here. The boys went to grade 4 here in Boise. And then as soon as grade 4 finished, we took off and we flew up to Alaska and started cycling. Our journey was absolutely fabulous. We ended up cycling a total of 27,000 miles in the 4 years on the road. And it was, another traveler once told me that when you're traveling, the highs are really high and the lows are really low. And I think that's a really good way of putting it, in that, yeah, we had some hard times. There's no question. There were some days that were really, really, really hard. But wow, the highs were so amazing. And it was so many little things. It was sitting at a bus stop on the side of the road and somebody coming up and handing us a bag of apples, or a truck stopping and the guys jump out and say, "Hey, do you want some tomatoes?" And we said, "Sure, we'd love some tomatoes." And we thought they're going to hand us a handful of tomatoes. And they jump out of the pickup truck and go back and pull out one of those great big, huge gunny sacks. You know what I mean? The great big, enormous gunny sacks that hold 125 pounds of tomatoes, and they take this whole thing out of the bed of the pickup and they put it at my feet and say, "Here," and they jump back in the truck to take off. And I'm like, wait, we can't carry all of this. And they're like, "Oh yeah." And so they come back and we just get another bag and they put 20 or 30 tomatoes in there and put the rest of them back in their pickup and take off. But it's little things like that that are just so amazing and show you what the human spirit is all about, and you get to know people. So, and I look back at all of those travels. Yeah, the scenery was spectacular and all of that kind of stuff was wonderful. But what I really remember are the people who went out of their way in so many ways to help us out or just to add magic to our journey. It was phenomenal.
Everybody in the panel, Nancy is putting their because for those of us that have traveled, I mean, this is a show about education, but this is an education. This is such an education. And those of us that have taken to the road to experience our learning and our education, our thumbs go up, because it is about the people and it's about those connections and experiences. I'm going to ask you a little bit later on to share some of those aha moments. But first, I'm actually going to jump on over to Rainer and ask Rainer if you can describe your family's adventure and let us know what that looked like for the year that you were on the road.
Yeah, it's hard to follow Nancy. I'll tell you that. But anyway, kudos to you, Nancy. You're
Not at all.
Inspiration to many.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
One thing that's worth noting here, actually, I think Nancy reached out to me while we were traveling. I remember
that. Yep.
I had the good fortune of being able to kind of document my journey, if you will, through National Geographic's blog called Intelligent Travel. So in case anyone's interested in kind of reading my whole story, it's there in the archives of National Geographic's Intelligent Travel. But I mentioned that in terms of technology as a platform. We left in the summer of 2008. So Facebook was not a household name. I didn't even really know what a blog was before I started to do it. I was asked to, so I said, okay. And the fact that we didn't have these social media platforms really made a big difference, because I think if we took this trip now, and Greg, I'm curious how involved you are with technology and social media in particular, and all these groups you can join, like this one, for example. That wasn't around, and it wasn't that long ago. I think if it had been, it would have really shaped the trip a lot differently, both positively and negatively. But I bring it up because, besides all the adventures that we went on, and there were several, we could have traveled nowhere. We could have stayed in our house, but if we had been together for a year, 365 days and then some, with literally every day, 24/7 being around each other, that is a big education. It's an education in developing as a family, learning who you are. What's your parenting style? I mean, there were things that came out, for example, my wife and I learned pretty quickly during the trip that we're very different parents. We kind of knew that, but it was on full display, throughout the entire journey. And that was a bit of getting used to, and we're still getting used to it. But now we're much more aware of it. So anyway, I'm making that point because, again, travel is not just learning, in an educational sense and an academic sense, but it's also learning about yourself and your family. And both Greg and Nancy have referred to people that they've met, particularly Nancy. Travel. I would bet you if you ask people to describe a vacation or a cycling from Alaska to Argentina, they're going to bring up people as much as they are places and experiences. So that's not to be overlooked. And I will say one thing. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I'm just kind of I think still answering the question. But my children, for at least a year. Again, I know Nancy's we're in a different situation, but for 1 year, they were removed from their natural environment, which was, school and their friends and, homework and those types of things, but particularly their friends. And, they spent almost their entire time with us and with other adults, mostly other adults. Very, very rarely were there other children around. And, I'm proud to say that both of them, who are now teenagers, interact with adults very, very well. We get complimented all the time on how articulate they are and how comfortable they are talking to adults. So again, I know the emphasis is going to be quite a bit on education and learning and that type of thing. But learning again can happen in very non-academic ways when you're talking about traveling on the road. So thought I'd add a little different perspective to it.
And actually, that leads into my next question. But before I go there, I know that Greg has a comment. So, Greg.
I'm just so excited about this because it just resonates so true. And I guess I want to add to that too. Education is not just academic. It can't be. And so you get out and travel, and we've experienced the same things, just the confidence, the ability to relate to and communicate effectively with young and old and rich and poor and races and backgrounds and religions, and just experience all those things. And as I've been listening to your great comments here, it's almost like there's a division between a tourist who goes out and like, oh, we saw this and did these things, that was great, and a traveler who goes out and meets people and has these experiences and these memories and this expansion and this growth. And it's so exciting. And to take, my wife and I were constantly learning and growing and improving, and watch our children do the same thing. It's so much more. It's spiritual, it's emotional, it's physical, it's social. It's incredible. And that's why I think we're all here saying, yeah, travel as education does so much more than just an academic. Like, it's more than facts and figures. It's wow. It's the whole person. It's holistic. I just love that whole idea.
Yeah, and if I could, again, I don't, we could go back and forth, Lainey doesn't have to say another word. I'm sure we could, spend the entire time here on this, but, when you think about it, is education really preparing children to face the real world? I mean, to go out and be, not just successful, striving, wage earners and so forth. But if education is setting up children for the real world, then you've got to mix the real world into the equation. Look, unless someone is engaged and really interested in something, they're not going to want to learn about it. But again, it's a combination of academics and real world, and travel takes care of the real world better than anything.
So well said. That is actually so well said. Now, that's a perfect segue into my next question. I am a long-term traveler too. I've been on the road with my son for 6 years. But our style of education is that of an unschooler. We identify with being an unschooler, which means we're natural learners. My son's education is guided by his interest and so forth. We're actually pretty storybook unschoolers. We're a really good example of that. So, Rainer, you took your family on a 1-year trip. How did you deal with education during that year? The idea of education. I know that the experience of education was different, but the idea of approaching education, what was your approach?
It's funny, when I mentioned to my wife today that I was going to be on the show, she said, I'm the one that should really be on it. Because she's the one that road schooled the kids. So maybe I should call her in. But no, to answer your question in terms of the approach, look, we did a little bit of homework and just found out we're from New York State. And, we found out, really what's involved or required to allow your children to graduate to kind of the next grade level if we were to do something like this. And it was really just to document your hours and what you taught your children. So California, for example, where I think you're from, you have to be an accredited teacher. So it's different in California. And I think it varies from state to state. So the approach was, my wife, to her enormous credit, took it seriously. So she made sure that the academics that were kind of required were covered during the year. And, they did it on planes. They did it, on kind of off days, if you will. So we found pockets of time to do it. But I still tease people and say, look, their year, if a typical school year for a child is 90% academic work, classroom focused, and 10% field trips, we were the opposite. we had about 10%, of the classroom work, well, maybe more, my wife would argue that, but, and 90% field trip, so we covered off on it, and there wasn't a strict schedule, but we just made sure it was, the requirements were covered. It's really that simple. But if you ask the children about, their memories of the year, I would highly doubt they would mention any of the academics.
That's funny. The great answer. Thanks. And actually, I want to move on to Greg. And if you could share with us how you educate your children. What's your approach, your official approach, and then talk about afterwards how travel plays into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we take, I'm a voracious learner, and my wife and I, in fact, that was what led to our marriage. I mean, we were talking about books on our first date, and I was like, all right, this girl reads, and we're intense about education. And so we've kind of just studied, picked up a philosophy, and we've been using the term world school for 3 or 4 years. Just the idea of getting out, having experiential learning combined with the book learning, and that combination together, like seeing it, feeling it, touching it, and then studying intensely. If you combine that, it makes for really great education. And so we've literally packed hundreds of books all over the world. I feel like a pack mule so often, and our pile of books keeps getting bigger and bigger. But it makes all the difference. And so we've kind of adopted what we like to call our Theodore Roosevelt education, because as a young man, his family would take their servants and just trunks and trunks full of books, and then they would go travel the world. And so when they were on a ship crossing the ocean, he was just hitting all the books, and then they'd get over there, they'd learn the language, they'd see the places. And that's kind of been our philosophy, that we take that perfect combination of getting in the classics, the great literature, plus all the incredible resources. Literally, and you guys will know this, in the last 5 years, things have changed so much with resources online that are free or easily available and inexpensive for great educational resources. And so now with technology available and great books and great resources and great experiences, if somebody's really conscious and really active, it can be a really great recipe for a world-class education. And that's our goal. We go in with the long-term in mind. What's the end result? What are our children be like as adults? And how can we make sure it's not that I'm not just, avoiding a system, and I'm not just avoiding some kind of structure, but I'm actually proactive and deliberate about getting a really great education for myself and for my children. And then, I have, like Nancy, I have years of experience teaching in both public and private, and now do a lot of mentoring for youth and young adults in a classical leadership-based education. And so it makes all the difference. So, how does it tie in? How does it affect our lives? It is our lives. In fact, this morning I had a conversation with one of the young men I mentor, and he says, we need to build our lives around learning and become, like you said, Lainey, lifelong learners. There's never a graduation from education.
I absolutely love that. Thank you. What a brilliant answer, and it's so inspirational. Thank you, Greg. And I'd like to move on to Nancy and ask you the same question.
I think that I need to kind of preface this with some of this theoretical stuff, and this is where my teacher background and my master's degree in education comes in. But when you actually look at what happens inside the brain when you learn something, we are born with all of the brain cells we're ever going to have. Okay, so you will have, that day you're born, you have all the brain cells you're going to have. Now, what happens after that is really dependent on a lot of your experiences, and that is what is ultimately going to drive your learning and your education. And that is the dendrites. Your brain actually creates physical connections from one cell to another cell called dendrites. And as you learn and you grow and you're challenged and you're thinking about things, you are creating this dendritic network within your brain. And the more complete that dendritic network is, or the more, not complete, I guess, but the more dense, the more dendrites you have an easier time learning other things, because you then have a hook to hang things in. Think about if a kid who is passionate about dinosaurs and they have learned all of these little bits and pieces about dinosaurs. Well, then if you give them some random fact, whatever it is, some bizarre random fact about dinosaurs, they can fit it in. They have that network in place, so they can slot that into place. And that is ultimately what learning is all about. I think that we have this tendency in America to separate the ideas or link the ideas between learning and education. And in our minds, education is that school stuff. That's the reading, writing, arithmetic, social studies, science. Education is that stuff. Learning is a very different situation. So the whole idea behind learning is creating this dendritic network within our brain. So how does that all work? Well, we know the science has showed us that kids develop those dendrites. They grow those dendrites, those connections between brain cells. They grow those dendrites in response to a challenging and stimulating environment. Any challenging, stimulating environment kids are in, and adults are in. It's just that kids are growing them at a rapid pace because that's what their body is designed to do. Any challenging, stimulating environment kids are put in, they are going to be growing those dendrites, which then facilitates learning everything else. So if you think about travel, if you think about whatever you're doing, how often are your kids in challenging, stimulating environments? Typically speaking, when we're at home, a large part of their day is happening during when it's not a real challenging environment. Whereas when you're traveling, they're constantly in a new environment, constantly going out, doing this, doing that. And so they're always in that challenging environment, and they're always growing those dendrites. So I think it's just kind of, and that when I was working on the education as we were traveling, that was in the forefront of my mind. Our kids are always learning. They are always growing those dendrites. They are always working to complete, or not complete, but to fill in that dendritic network within their brain. And so I didn't worry so much about the specifics. If they learned about the Panama Canal, fine. I had no problem with that. Maybe it's not in the curriculum back home, but I didn't care because they were developing that dendritic network, and that's all good. So I think that the key is to remember that it doesn't matter what they are learning, just that they are learning. So the very idea of learning something, of learning anything, of being challenged and stimulated and creating that dendritic network in your brain, that is what is important. It's not so much the actual content in terms of what they're learning. Does that make any sense?
Amazing
Yes.
answer. Wow. Of education shifted through our travel into it already. Perspective of what education and learning is. Excuse me while my dog is trying to get in the front row here. I wanted to ask everybody how. This was a great lead-in. Nancy, I wanted to ask everybody how the idea, the definition of education shifted through travel. I'm sure, been very open and very flexible, but how did even your idea shift as you started traveling?
I often tell this story Daryl was always very advanced. Daryl started reading when he was, 4 years old. Daryl was always very, very advanced academically. Davy, I think because Davy could rely on his twin brother, he really had no need to do these things on his own. And so grade 1, he was below, when they do the tests in school. He was below grade level in reading, wasn't reading very well at all. So we kind of up the ante a bit, I guess. We started reading with him and putting more of a focus on that. And by grade 2, by the time he left grade 2, he was reading at grade level, but barely. He was, he could do it, but he wasn't very fluent. And then we took off. So right after grade 2, we took off on our bike trip. And this was our first bike trip. You can imagine that John and I were overwhelmed. We had never been out on the bikes with the kids before. We were having to buy food. We're having to cook food. We're having to set up the tent. We're having to break down the tent. We're having to ride our bikes. We're having to take care of these kids. We were really overwhelmed. And we ended up not reading with Davy at all, like nothing, zero. Didn't read with this kid at all. We always read a bedtime story at night, but we didn't sit down. As far as we knew, Davy hadn't read a single thing from the time we left school until this particular day on the Oregon coast. And that morning, we were about 2 months into our trip now. And that morning we woke up and it was raining, and we decided we didn't want to ride in the rain. And so we stayed in our tent, and our tent was this itty bitty, teeny tiny little tent. And we had 4 of us crammed in there. And all day long, we're stuck in the tent. We were reading, the read aloud book that we were reading for a bedtime story at the time was Where the Red Fern Grows, which is written at about a 4th grade level. And we pulled out the book, and I read and read and read and read until I couldn't read anymore. And I finally handed the book to John, and John read and read and read and read. And then he gave it to me. And then we started taking turns. I would read a chapter, then John would read a chapter, then Daryl would read a chapter, then me, then John, then Daryl, then me, then John, then Daryl. And of course, we skipped Davy because Davy couldn't read it, right? Davy was barely reading at a second grade level, and this book was at a fourth grade level. And at one point, and I still don't know why, but John handed the book to Davy and said, "Here, Davy, read a chapter for us." And it was one of those moments where, as a mother, my heart kind of dropped, and I thought, oh, cripes, my son is about ready to be humiliated, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. But Davy picked up that book, written at a fourth grade level, and he read it flawlessly, absolutely, completely flawlessly. And I remember sitting there in that tent, listening to this kid read, and I thought, how did that happen? And over the next few days, I pondered that question. How did this happen? How did Davy go from barely reading at a grade 2 level to reading perfectly fluently at a fourth grade level in only 2 months? How could this happen? And I really think, getting back to the whole idea of this dendritic network, I really think that what happened was, during that 2 months, he had been challenged so much, challenged and stimulated nonstop every single day, day in and day out. His brain was creating this dendritic network, and it was filling in those gaps, and it was creating those connections so that then it came out later and we could see the effects of that. So that moment, that listening to this kid read, that was the moment when I let go of all of those preconceived notions of, I have to work on reading, I have to work on writing, I have to work on this, I have to work on that. Because at that point, I knew that the kids would be able to learn all of that. So it was 2 months into the trip where there was just this very, very, very dramatic experience. And that changed my perspective entirely.
Wow, that must have been difficult to do as a teacher too, because you have ideas, I imagine, what should be achieved at what age. So that's pretty incredible. Yeah.
You know, I think once I had seen it in action, I had seen that Davy had done this. And then I was like, okay. And the funny thing is, my husband kept saying, Nancy, you're not working on writing enough. You're not working on writing enough. And I was like, they know how to write. They'll be fine. I'm not concerned about it. And he's like, but you need to have them write. They're not learning about writing. And it's funny because now my boys are 17. They are still homeschooled, but they are taking some classes through the public schools. And one of them has opted to take AP English and Composition this year. And he is pulling off a B. Absolutely no problem. I mean, it's a lot of work for him, but he's writing beautifully, obviously learned what he needed to write. In fact, he decided to take that class this year because he said he didn't want his very first English class ever to be at college. And so he decided to take AP English now as a junior in high school.
Wow, incredible. Great. Thank you for sharing that. And Brader, I want to jump on over to you. Did you have something to add to this conversation about the idea of education and learning shifting as a result of your travel experience?
Yeah, I love the way Nancy kind of comes in with the scientific explanation as well as personal experience. So bravo to that. Look, I think it's pretty simple. And it's interesting because I haven't really contemplated this all that deeply. But just being involved in this conversation, and obviously I've come across the topic a few times, but I think it's pretty simple. And this is just, shielding through observation, is that, children learn when they're interested. I think that whether you're traveling or not, and what happens when you travel is you become interested. I think we all know that children, particularly at a young age, are incredibly curious. I mean, I think that's innate in most children. Again, whether, all these synapses have developed or detrites, whatever the technical terms are, I think we all know that curiosity is there. And I think that needs to be fed. I think that's really important. And, sometimes, and this is not a judgment on school or the academic system, but sometimes it doesn't stimulate the kids, whether the teachers aren't good or whatever the reasons are. Children just aren't interested. I think it would be very difficult for children not to be interested and engaged when they're traveling to places that are unfamiliar, that are new. And by the way, depending on who's in the audience, obviously you're talking to some folks here who have taken this to a bit of an extreme compared to most. But you don't have to travel around the world. You don't have to do it for a year. You don't have to do it for 3 years. You don't have to do it for your entire life. Do it for a weekend. Do it in little bits and pieces and get the kids interested. So I think, and that's what I noticed, that wherever we went, and we shifted gears, we went from Africa to Asia, and then all of a sudden we were in Europe, and then next thing we woke up in South America, and my wife and I we were struck by, how versatile the kids were in shifting gears. Like all of a sudden they went from a highly Buddhist culture and society to, going on safari in Africa. And then all of a sudden they became animal experts and but they were interested, and they were interested because they were being exposed. So I think, again, that's not a very difficult formula. So whether you're homeschooling, road schooling, or traditionally schooling, getting the kids interested is the key, and travel does that, again, I think, as good as anything.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you forgot to add unschooling.
And unschooling, of course.
And unschooling. So right. You brought up something in the beginning of this conversation, and that was about the things that you learned as a family. You learned about family connections. You learned about, you and your wife learned about your parenting styles, about your teaching styles, about your learning styles. But you really learned how to negotiate, how to function as a family and learn and travel together. And that is, teaching team building, communication. That is teaching like all of these life skills that our kids will take with them throughout their life that perhaps traditional schools don't really focus on. So I'm glad you touched on those things, Rainer, as well, the non-academic learning. I actually want to move on over to Greg, because you've got a big family that needs to negotiate how you function as a family, as a unit. So you're learning, you're traveling, and you're living together 24/7 as a group of how many people, Greg?
We have 6 children, so there's 8 of us.
8 people. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of those things that you've learned as functioning as a traveler in as a family unit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so fun adapting, and we have that full range. Our oldest is 12, our youngest is 1. We're very passionate and intense about education, and so and how to balance all those things, right? How to fit in time, and how to make sure you're getting your priorities and keeping your routines or your rituals, and actually do it in an effective way wherever you are in the world. And so we've had to set up systems or rituals, routines that we stick to, so we make sure that we keep an end result. And I guess my comment here, I kind of want to tag to the previous question, is how has that education shifted, and then how are we doing it as a family? I think the most important thing for anyone, and Rainer, I loved your comment about people just getting out. I mean, so many of us don't even know our own city, our own neighboring places. I mean, people would fly in from all over the world to go see the Grand Canyon. I didn't see it till I was like 30. I'm like, come on, I was only like 6 hours away. I didn't go. But we can get out and have those experiences. But I think one of the most important elements is we have a vision of what we want. And what is it we really want? What's the end result? It's not just now. It's not just this experience. It's not just the semester or the grade level. It's what do we want our children to be like? What do we want to be like? How are we going to grow? How are we going to expand? And the biggest thing for us as we've moved from country to country with great interest in getting involved, I've gotten involved and taught in every place we've been. And seeing how their school systems work and what options they have available. And so to see all these different educational systems and models, and then to study that throughout history, you really find the 3 main systems, which was, a basic educational level for the masses, and then a professional training level, and then leadership education. And if you look at all the major societies throughout history, there's been those three things where too many people just get into one, and that's all they see and that's all they think. But you have to expand that and really come in a clear vision of where you're going and how to get there, and what kind of end results you want, what kind of education you want for yourself and for your children. And then create that on a daily basis as a family to set up your goal, your plan, and move toward the level of education you really want to get to. And I guess one of my greatest fears at the whole educational level is that we set too low of a standard. And we think, oh yeah, if I graduate, or if I get a degree, a certificate, or diploma, or whatever, do these certain things, I jump through these hoops, then I'm done. And that would just break my heart. I think if we set a standard too low, it's a tragedy and leaves people below their potential. And I think one of the greatest things that Rachel and I want to do in this movement is really take education to a whole other level, where it's very inspiring, very stimulating. Like Nancy talked about, Rainer talked about, getting the stimulation, getting them active, getting them exposed to new ideas and new things, and getting those connections happening, and getting them excited and interested, so they continue to be, like we said before, lifelong learners. They continue on that path of becoming their very best selves.
Yeah, so well said, Greg. And I think each person in the panel has said this in one way or another, that the key to education, to learning, is really the engagement, the involvement, the immersion in the experience. It's having that experience. So, did anybody want to add anything to that before we go break?
I just think the important thing that we remember is that kids learn no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing. Before I had always worked with older kids, and then I was going to teach grade 1 at one point, and I remember just being terrified. I'm like, I knew how to teach kids how to read better, but I didn't know how to teach them to read. And I was so scared of doing grade 1. And a teacher friend of mine said, don't worry about Nancy. Don't worry about kids. The kids will learn in spite of their teacher. And I totally believe that. Kids learn, and if we just put them into environments that challenge them and stimulate them, they will learn.
Yeah, agreed. Wonderful. Before we go to break, though, I actually want to ask one more question. And that question is, in terms of travel, how does travel differ in terms of the immersion aspects versus like the classroom setting? How can travel offer something that's more immersive and more involved versus the classroom system? Nancy?
I'm sorry, trying to find my unmute button. So the idea between the immersion of travel versus a classroom. I think the problem with the classroom is that we have to artificially create this background knowledge. In order for kids to understand things, they have to have this background knowledge. And we are trying to artificially create that. I remember having a grade 4 student one time. We were reading a book about this flea that was jumping around and going from here to there or whatever. And Brian just was not getting this book. He just absolutely was not understanding. We read the book, we read it over again, and it was just a complete blank. And finally, he was a little Navajo boy. And finally, in a complete exasperation, I said, Brian, what is a flea? And he said, I don't know. And so I gave him the Navajo word for flea, and all of a sudden, boom, the entire story made sense. So it's this background information that kids don't have necessarily in the schools, and that we are having to artificially create. And with travel, the things that we're helping our kids learn, they have that they have the background information. It's there. It's ready for them. They've already got it. So when you're going and you're going to learn about the Panama Canal, well, the Panama Canal is there. So it kind of just makes that whole background knowledge thing, that's an issue that doesn't exist when you're traveling, but it does exist in a classroom.
You know, I just want to make a point also about travel immersion versus kind of academic immersion. You know, when you travel, and I found this to be the experience with my children, is it gives them the opportunity to explore and to discover in a much different way. In other words, I think they learn really about their interests. You know, Nancy, you just said that you try to artificially create, you know, something in a classroom. There's you know, it comes naturally in you know, in travel. You go to places where, whether it's music or culture or food or people, and you know, those things are all just kind of hitting you, and I think children will kind of gravitate to things that they, again, are interested in, and then they can immerse themselves in it more. So, you know, I think if you look at education as being, you know, covering one subject into the next and going to a different classroom and doing math and then English, then history and social studies, you know, travel is, you immerse yourself in different things. Again, food, culture, science, you know, history, you know, all of the, and immersing yourself in that will tell you more about yourself and what you're interested in. So then when you do go to the academic world, if you will, you can focus on those things that you're interested in. You know, I know it's a whole different philosophy, you know, whether it's called unschooling or the different titles that it's given. But, you know, the one thing that, and Greg mentioned this very, very well, is that, you know, he had an end game in mind, or has an end game in mind. You know, our end game, if you will, was broader, but it was, we wanted our children to kind of figure out what it is that excited them, that made them feel alive, and what their natural interests are. And I've told them that when they return to school, like, look, if you don't do well in math, but you excel in English or engineering, you know, kids find their way. That, you know, immerse yourself in the things that you connect and you're interested in, and then, you know, use your life and school to pursue that with more vigor. I hope that made sense, but I think that's really important. In terms of the different, it's a very different immersion.
Agreed. And Greg, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to love both those comments, and just wanted to kind of add, I'm sure we could go on for hours here, just from the experiences we've had collectively, go on for hours about the learning that takes place in the situations and how it all kind of fits together. You know, and we've had that too. And there's some things that just can't happen unless you're there experiencing. I took some of my children, the older ones, and we went and we were serving and helping in a leprosy colony in southern India with people with leprosy. And to be there at that level of connection with these special human beings who are suffering from this horrible disease and being outcasts from society, to experience that at that level. And then we started a humanitarian organization in Guatemala, where, you know, so malnourished and the living conditions are so terrible. And I took my children with me and to experience that at that level, and to get an idea of how some people live and exist. Just the ideas are coming. Then another time we watched the monarch migration in southern Mexico. We were there. We walked up in southern Mexico, and literally, without exaggeration, there were tens of millions of monarch butterflies all around us. You can't get that. You can't do it. You can't show a video of that and have an experience, or a book or a classroom. You're just there, and there are butterflies were everywhere. And you're okay. My kids can now, like Nancy was saying, they got something to hang on with butterflies and migration and numbers, and just astounding. And I'm sure we could all share the experience, but it makes it so real and makes it remarkable. You know, if we all live a humdrum existence, do the same thing year after year after year, we don't have years of experience. We have the same experience year after year. But if we can go out and make it remarkable, make it special, then it really creates those scenes for an epic life.
Amazing. Thank you. And actually, we're going to go take a break right now. It's a little over 10 minutes. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some more of those experiences. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Albert Einstein said that no problem can be solved from the consciousness that created it. We have to learn to see the world anew. So with that in mind, today we've got a call to action. We have a question for you. And we'd like you to think about this for a minute or talk to somebody close to you. The question is this: how much are your life's decisions constrained by what you're expected to do and when you're expected to do it? Today, we challenge you to change. We challenge you to become an invincible. We want you to go and see the world. Go and find out. Find out for yourself, and we'll see you, the real you, when you return. Now, we know that university is on the map for all of us, and that's probably not something that's going to go away in the near future. So why rush? Why rush towards 3 or 4 more years of compulsory education? Why not something different? Sir Francis Bacon said that in the young person, education was travel. And in the older person, education experience. And since the times of Plato in ancient Greece, since the Renaissance, we've known that real education really does take place outside of the gates. And yet still relatively few people take the risk to make a compulsory travel experience part of their independent learning. It's been said that the older generation can only give 2 gifts to the younger: roots and wings. And yet by institution and convention, we sometimes nail our young people to the floor. What is education? What's education for? And most importantly, who's education for? I think the answers to these 3 questions are clear. Education is lifelong learning, education must be sustainable, and education must promote peace. Most importantly, education has to be inclusive for all. Now, we're all familiar with the traditional model. School, university, graduate degree,
Cha-ching!
job, retirement, and death. And I hope that we can all agree this is an outdated model, except for perhaps the death part. So how can we encourage a spirit of adventure? How can we encourage exploration, both inner and outer, to become a rule rather than an exception? I really believe that independently traveling alone can reconnect us and help us to empathize with other people. We can come up with sustainable and inspirational solutions for all. In 2012, an estimated 2.5 million young people left the UK to go on independent travel experiences. Of that 2.5 million, 30% travelled alone. Now, 11% of Australians have at least a 1-year travel experience before university. Harvard University, as ever ahead of its time, has been recommending a year out in its letters of admission for over 40 years. And the numbers are growing. From the UK, Canada, the US, countries in Europe, Scandinavia, Australia and New Zealand. And the research coming back is really interesting. Most of the young people do return to formal education, and almost all of them do very well. Perhaps more importantly, becoming closer with other human beings through independent traveling ultimately emphasizes the humanist in us all. The idea of using travel to become culturally competent, to be curious to the ways of others, to help find solutions to problems, to open our minds to different uses of word or language, to genuinely experience the fun and challenge of freedom. This is education. Today we challenge you to be the next group of invincibles. And sometimes such a challenge can be inspired by the words of others. So we've got a few travel stories to whet your appetites. Io sono scozzese. Ho abitato in Italia 10 anni fa. Ho imparato la lingua. E adesso la lingua è sempre con me.
I'm Scottish. I lived in Italy 10 years ago. I learned the language, and the language is always with me.
In my first few months in Malawi in southern Africa, I was lucky enough to be invited to play in a fairly important football match. Of the 22 players playing, my face was the only white one. There was a local crowd of about 6,000 people, all of them, of course, beautiful and brown. As I looked to the other end of the field and the opposition warming up, I could see them bouncing and stretching and moving in time to the chants of the crowd.
Mazungu! Mazungu! Mazungu!
White man, white man, white man. I must admit the fear at that moment made me feel like not playing, and yet 20 minutes later I was playing. Close to the touchline in the crowd, I managed to pull off a good move and a good pass. They cheered.
Mazungu! Mazungu!
In that moment, all cultural barriers came down. Language barriers gone, instead to be replaced by mutual appreciation, a love of sport, and potential friendship. On another occasion, I was alone on a train in southern Japan. As I sat down on the bench, I was startled when a small hand reached through the gap in the chairs to grab my unshaven face. At the end of the hand was a small arm, and attached to the arm, a 2-year-old boy climbed over me and the chair to look in my alien blue eyes. At that moment, I understood the openness and honesty of children, and at the same time, the sometimes closed and conventional nature of adults. His mother was horrified, and so was I. St. Augustine said that the world is a book, and those that don't travel read only one page. The Prophet Muhammad advised, don't tell me how educated you are, tell me how much you've traveled. Later, Helen Keller said, life is either daring adventure or nothing at all. And Aristotle simply said, adventure is worthwhile. Poetry is another way for us to tell our stories. And here's one on travel and journeys.
The bridge is here.
Walk. Take your hands.
In your hand. Throw your mind to the edge.
Catch your mind.
Dance your legs.
And cross.
Cross with all your journey.
Your mother's father. And father's mother.
And mother's father's father's mother. And father's mother's mother's father knew.
Yeah.
And walk.
And walk.
You've come too far to fear further. So, this morning, what does all this mean? Why the challenge to conventional, the status quo of education? Yes, travel helps us to understand. And traveling alone helps us to understand and know ourselves. But it's more than that. We know that the current economic, political, consumerist model creates more hunger, more violence, more poverty. So the stand we're asking you to take is a moral one. Do we really care? I really believe that independently traveling alone can help us to care again. We can become much more than competent tourists who simply see sights. We need to refine some balance. And how is balance possible when every nook and cranny of our busy worlds is filled with computers? We need to disconnect to reconnect. Now, to travel alone and independently takes courage. And we have to address some of the common fears. What about my safety in this dangerous world? What about falling behind the competition? How much does it cost? Yes, the world is a very dangerous place, but surely awareness of this is key. Why should risk or danger stop us from doing anything? We'd never leave the house. Falling behind the competition. What competition? We've heard from many famous TED Talks that the current educational model was designed for a time when people didn't live much beyond 40 years old. You're not part of that paradigm. Take your time. The cost is up to you. But think of it like this. They tell us that a one-year travel experience by an independent traveller costs somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 British pounds. If you can start saving or earning at the beginning of your grade 10 and save or earn £100 a month until the end of your grade 12, you've got that money. Now, our call to travel as education was perhaps epitomised best by the words of Mark Twain when he said this: 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the things you did. So throw off the bowlines. Sail away from the safe harbour. Catch the trade winds in your sails. Explore, dream, and discover. Thank you.
I hope that you've enjoyed that. And I think that it's just so fascinating that there's actually a TED Talk that is entitled Education, Travel is Education, and it speaks to what we're talking about today. However, there is a difference. The TED Talk that we just watched talks about gap years, and this panel really does not represent the gap year, but I thought it was an important part to the conversation. Gap year in the United States is when a high school student finishes high school and they go, instead of going to college, they opt for a year of travel. And we could see how powerful that can be in terms of getting an education and really expanding the learner, expanding their worldview. And that's kind of where I want to go next. So Rainer, let's start off with you. One of the things that I want to dive into is the concept of learning worldviews. And to me, that's something I'm extremely passionate about. I think it's so important to be able to recognize what your own worldview is, and when you're experiencing the world and traveling, to be able to see the world from your host country's worldview, how they're seeing things differently, and how that really affects your experience. Do you have some experiences that you can share?
It's interesting that you phrase it that way in terms of worldview. Well, first, I'll give my 15-second promotional plug. It's not a promotional plug, but right now, well, since I got back from the trip, one of the things that I've kind of committed myself to was to try to inspire, particularly American families, to travel and to travel more, and also to advocate that travel be a part of every child's education, an essential part of every child's education. So the reason that became a goal and ambition, and now we've launched the Family Travel Association, as you mentioned at the introduction, is because something that I realized pretty quickly, and I kind of knew this anyway, but it was certainly confirmed during our time away, is that Americans have a very different worldview than the rest of the world, and not just about the rest of the world, but about the value and importance of travel. And to really to simplify it, and this is a broad generalization, and I know that there are literally millions of Americans who actively travel and take their children with them to all parts of the world. But by and large, Americans, and particularly families, look at the travel experience as being recreational as opposed to transformational. In other words, it's a time to go to Disney, a time to get away and relax on a beach, theme parks, all-inclusive resorts, cruise ships offer climbing walls. It's all about kind of fun and entertainment. And there's certainly nothing wrong with Disney. I've been on cruise ships. I've done all kinds of, pure kind of unadulterated, fun, recreational experiences with my kids. But I think, Americans are not as aware or innately attuned to the fact that travel has an ability to teach and to engage children and to have it be transformational. And where that worldview, well, not worldview, but where that comes from, or our lack of kind of intuitive understanding of this power of travel, because you don't need to convince Germans or Israelis or Australians or the Brits or anyone else really around the world that travel really serves a higher purpose than just purely being recreational. So, again, very broad statement, but I think in large part, American culture is very focused on materialism. It's what you have as opposed to what you experience. So I think, and by the way, for some of you who may have seen a MasterCard commercial that has children kind of begging their parents to just take one more vacation day, of course, so they can use their MasterCard. But the interesting fact is there are 490 million vacation days that go unused every year here in the United States. It's actually insane. So for those that even have the vacation time, which is generally more limited than the rest of the world, they're not even using it. So maybe I'm not answering your question directly, but I will say that the American view on travel is very different. And I think in part that reflects on a broader sense of a worldview and acceptance of other cultures and so forth. I'm not going to make any political statements certainly tonight, but if you look at the past two presidents, George Bush, for example, who was the son, of course, of a president, had really never left North America before he was president. That shapes his worldview and shaped his policy, as you could probably see. Whereas Barack Obama, of course, lived in other countries, had a much broader exposure to different religions and so forth. And look at his agenda and record. And again, I don't want to get political, but I think that's a really strong confirmation of the power of travel to change worldview. So again, I don't know if I'm answering the question directly, but the idea of a gap year that you mentioned, a lot of Americans don't even know what that means, what a gap year is. And those that do, very few would consider it, because that's just, we are so conditioned to, going to college, graduating with a degree, and then going into a career so you can make money and become another consumer. So sorry for, maybe the little digression there, but so worldview, seeing other worldviews, I think is important. And not just shaping your own, but understanding, the important fact that we do live now in a global economy and a global society. And quite frankly, if we are going to raise competitive young adults that are going to go into the workforce, it's likely that it's going to be a global workforce, and that they'll need to really have that perspective if they do want to be successful in the future.
Yeah, no, you answered it perfectly. And I think your perspective is really spot on. I don't want to get political on the show either. But I think it is important to realize, especially for Americans, and this show here, this is an international show. So we have people from Europe and people from all over the world watching. It's not just an American-based show. But I think those that were raised in the first world, quote unquote, first world countries, we have a very our country centric, whichever country we're from, our country centric perspective of how we interact with the world. And once we get out of that bubble, we see that, number one, we encounter people, right? People just like you and I, people that want nothing but, joy and happiness and education and love and health and all of those things. But also we see people that have completely different perspectives and traditions and cultures, and that human connection through travel allows us to see the world from somebody else's eyes. And I think that is the biggest learning that we've had through our travel, besides, of course, all the experiences. So, Rainer, you completely answer that question right on.
All right.
So thank you for that. I want to jump on over to Nancy next and ask you the same question.
I think one thing, well, okay, and I've kind of been questioning this. It seems like everybody I know who has traveled widely tends to not enter into the Muslim bashing that we're having going on in the US, and all of the making these broad uniform statements about this group or that group, or this country is dirty, or that country is dangerous, or this group of people is bad, or whatever. The people I know who have traveled broadly don't tend to go there. They don't tend to say that. People who haven't traveled are much more likely to jump into that bumping huge groups together. And I've wondered about which came first, the chicken or the egg. Is it the people who are able to see individuals within the masses? Are we the ones who choose to go traveling? Or is it the other way around? Has the travel actually changed us? And, I don't know the answer, and I don't think I will ever know that answer. But it's kind of an interesting thought to ponder. I can say with absolute certainty that people who have traveled broadly see individuals. They don't see a Muslim or an African or whatever. Will see individuals and will understand that, sure, there are some Muslims who are bad people. That's true. There are some Africans who are bad people, who are dirty people, who are whatever. There are some Americans who are bad people or who are dirty people, and we are more likely to look at the individuals. And like I said, I don't know, is it the chicken or the egg that came first, but I do think that there is a definite correlation as you have seen and you've gotten to know people and you have established relationships with people of different religions, of different races, that wear different clothes, eat different food, worship different gods, whatever. You can't help but consider the news stories in a different light, and you see human beings as opposed to numbers. And that, I think, is huge. And I really, truly believe that if we could get every person in this world to see humans rather than numbers, we would have a completely different world.
Amazing answer. Thank you, Nancy. I think what you're talking about is experiencing compassion through travel as a result of travel. And I couldn't think of any better reason, if that's the only reason. We'll end up being in a more compassionate and peaceful world. I think what you said was powerful. Thank you. I want to move on over to Greg and ask you the same question.
I love this. This is one of the things I speak about often and really get excited about, because we all see the world through lens. We all have a lens that we look through. And Nancy, I love your thoughts there. I'm with you. I don't know, was it the love for humanity that got us out, or was it getting out that makes you love humanity more? And you see the good, bad, and the ugly, but you're actually there on the ground, in the arena, like Theodore Roosevelt says, and you're experiencing it, and you're with those people, right? I was in a really, really rough neighborhood last week in Lima with these wonderful, wonderful people who I love. This woman who I love is my second mother, and to be there in that place changes the way I see that place and the world and people. So I guess one of the thoughts, and why travel is so important to do this, particularly in your paradigm, is I think there is an optimal view. I think there is a best perspective, and we can continue to expand our realities and our perspectives. So I guess one of the questions that we have to constantly ask ourselves is how can we how can we ensure that we ourselves and our children, if we're taking out to travel, how can we help them gain a really healthy view? And what experience? And yeah, I think you have to be deliberate, because I think all of us here probably know someone who's gone out and traveled and didn't change their perspective. They kind of came back even more jaded, or like, oh, I've been to that horrible place. You're like, what? We didn't have the same experience, because wow. But how can we be deliberate about that? How can we? And I'm with Rainer. I think every single person should travel at least once. I mean, at least once, get out. I really think it should be a part of education. And how can we get out there and have that view? As we've traveled, Mexico's a really great example, because people think it's so dangerous. And we've driven border to border multiple times, really slowly. Sometimes camping, sometimes hotels. Our friends just went through there again for their 8th time. Arizona, Texas, all the way to Guatemala. And inevitably, every time, oh, don't go to Mexico, you'll die. You'll lose your children. You'll this and that. And oh, man, the big scares. You couldn't possibly tell my children that it's not a wonderful place. They love Mexico. We love Mexico, right? And yeah, exactly. Nancy's mentioning there that so many Americans think it's so dangerous and so horrible. And I try to tell them, no, it's wonderful. I love Mexico. Oh, the food and the people and the places, it's incredible. And my children have that reality, right? And it's just and Nancy, you went through on bikes. I mean, you really got experience at a personal, close level. And so how do we create that? And how do we get out and have those experiences? How do we change the reality? I mentioned earlier, we're going to Morocco. I'm so thrilled to go there and experience myself and then share, hey, we're living in a Muslim country among wonderful people. When we were in India, there were the Hindus and the Muslims right there, and we got to know them, and their kids play with their kids, and it's a different level. So how can we get that paradigm in the right place? And I guess if you travel intentionally and deliberately with a great attitude and seeing people holistically, then it really helps change that reality where, the thoughts I had about Mexico City, and then, what we have now, the memories of the incredible experiences. They're riding the subway. You think you're going to die, but actually they were so helpful and so kind and so sweet. And me and my 5 little kids cramming into a subway train and going through Mexico City, it was amazing.
Incredible. What a great story. Thank you, Greg. And actually, I want to start with you for the next question. Why don't you share with us some of those aha moments that really demonstrated that you're on path? This is working. Your children are learning. You are growing as a family. And this moment, this aha moment just demonstrates it.
I guess there's a lot of experiences. I don't know that it's one particularly stands out, but just for us as a family, we really feel alive. And that's like, you feel like you're really living, not just merely existing. Like, I'm alive. And we saw it over and over, I don't know, all these memories come to mind. I remember my children running and playing hide and go seek in the redwood forest in Northern California. They just thought that was the ultimate playground. And like, I could see my little boy just like, oh, I love this place. And they've done that hundreds of times now. We've gone through places and jumping off these cliffs into Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. Just incredible. 2 weeks ago, we hiked a 400-foot, actually it's a 600-foot waterfall just up through the jungle. And in this picture on top with our whole family right there, just this epic adventure that they're going to remember, and it's shaping their life. And for us, and then making a difference, going somewhere, serving someone, touching someone's life in a positive way, leaving a place better than you found it. I mean, each of those things adds to this whole experience, and you sit back. I like to record my journal, and I did a journal entry and just thought, wow, this is so fantastic. Well, each of you know this. You guys know this. And I guess to the people listening, saying, if you're thinking about going out, do it. Go live. And you'll feel so alive, and you'll record it, and you'll look back and be like, that was so incredible. And I'm so grateful I did it. And I hope that no one ever would get to the end, look back and say, man, I sure wish I had done that and not do that.
If I could answer that question as well, also with a comment for the audience. And a lesson that I learned pretty quickly, but it was really hit home with a particular incident. But never, do not underestimate your kids and what they will be interested in or like, because they'll amaze you. Our particular turning point was pretty specific, I think, at least for me and my wife. We had the real fortunate opportunity to visit Bhutan during our travels, and that's of course a country in the middle of the Himalayas, pretty far removed. It borders India and China, and you're a privileged guest when you go there. But anyway, Bhutan, of course, is a highly Buddhist society and culture. There are very few visitors. It's at high altitude. The food is awful. I mean, there is nothing "quote unquote" kid friendly about it. And we arrived, and we were part of a group of about 20 people. And I knew for sure that we would probably have the only 2 children on this trip, which of course was the case. And I told my boys with a high degree of anxiety, listen, guys, people are here for a pretty serious vacation. Many of them, this is kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I do not want you guys to ruin anyone's experience. If you find Buddhism boring, or if you think the food is awful, or whatever you might want to complain about, do not do it. And if you don't want to go out one day, fine, you'll stay back in the room. And anyway, as a parent, I was just very concerned that what I thought could be negative attitude about the trip would ruin the experience for others. And, the first night when we met the rest of the group, of course, I definitely noticed on people's faces the kind of surprise. I don't want to say horror, of course, but surprise that there were 2 young boys on the trip. Like, what are they doing here? Got the nice courteous hellos, but, clearly there was a bit of reservation that 2 children were on this trip. I will say that 16 days later, when we all said goodbye to one another, there wasn't a single person who didn't thank us for coming, but particularly that the boys were so wonderful. They were motivation. They had the best time probably of anyone in the entire group. They loved the culture. They tolerated the food. The altitude didn't get to them, but they really found this incredible connection with Buddhism and the whole country that I would never have anticipated. So that was a real learning experience, and just again reiterating that children, do not underestimate them and what they might find interesting and connect with, because it surely surprised the heck out of us. And after that, it was smooth sailing. We knew that wherever we went, it wasn't gonna be a big deal. So anyway, hopefully that
amazing.
Was some words of wisdom for the audience.
Great. That was an amazing story. Thank you, Rainer. And Nancy, why don't you go ahead and share some of your aha moments?
I love the idea of these aha moments, because they really are those moments where you realize this is okay. We're on the right track. And I have 2 that I have thought about that I think will really demonstrate what I think is really important. One of the things that I think that we all need to learn and know is the idea of connections between things, that whole idea of those dendritic connections, and being able to link what we have learned in the past with this new information coming in. And so when we were in southern Mexico, we went to this museum where they had all of these great big heads, these stone heads that were made back long time ago by the old Meccan people. And they're just these fascinating heads. And we just walked around and we were just kind of fascinated with the idea of looking at these massive heads. I mean, we're talking massive heads. They're like 8 feet high or something. They're huge, huge, huge carved heads. So we learned a bit about the Olmecans, and okay, that was that. Well, fast forward a month or so, and we were in Belize, and we took a tour of these Mayan ruins. And we're walking around these Mayan ruins and climbed up, some temples and all of the pyramids and all that. And at one point, our guide brought us to this area, and he said, well, this is the only temple that they actually started excavating to see what was inside the temple. He said all the others, they took all the dirt off and stuff, but then they left the temple itself. This one, they wanted to see what was inside. So when they started taking these layers off, they got 3 layers down and they found this face. So there's this big face that's carved into the side of this pyramid, like 3 layers, in. And just my iPhone. Okay, got it. And so we were looking at this face. So it's like carved 3 layers in, and we're looking at this face. And Davey, who was 11 at the time, turned to me and he said, he turned to the guide and he said, did the Olmecans used to live here? And the guide kind of looked at Davey and he was kind of confused. And he said, well, this face looks like these heads that we saw up in Mexico. And indeed, he was absolutely right. It was the same kind of features. They had these great big teeth, and there were certain features in these heads that Davey then saw in this pyramid down in Belize. He had made that connection. That is what learning is about, okay? Learning is about being able to integrate new information slot it into our head somewhere in a way that we can then retrieve it. We have a way of understanding and figuring out that information. That was one of those moments when I said, wow, this is cool. I mean, here's an 11-year-old kid who made that connection. I didn't even make that connection, but this 11-year-old kid saw that correlation and said, you know what? The Olmecan tribe wasn't only in Mexico. It was obviously down here in Belize as well. Another aha moment was the day we were going to cross the equator. Now, of course, here in the U.S. in school, we're always taught that at the equator, it's hot. It's hot at the equator. It's hot and it's humid. And he's like, yes, it is indeed. But the day we crossed the equator, we were way up in the mountains. So yes, we were in Ecuador, but we were at 8,000 feet in the mountains. We got up that morning. We stopped at a place 7 kilometers from the equator. And that morning we got up and got packed up, and we literally pulled out our winter woolies and we put on our big jackets and our sweaters and our wool tights and our gloves, and we're pedaling away from the hotel, and these big poofs of the clouds of vapor are coming out of our mouth every time we breathe. And as we were riding, Davey turned to me and he said, Mom, he said, I'm confused. He said, I learned that it's hot at the equator. And I said, that's one of those fallacies that we teach as a generality, when in fact it's not necessarily the case. The case is that at the equator, temperature has more to do with elevation than it does with being at the equator. Sure, if you're at sea level, it's going to be hot and humid, but you get up in the mountains and it's not. And I thought that was one of those moments where I realized that this kid was trying to make sense of all of this data that was coming in, trying to organize it, trying to figure out how all of this pieces together. So those were kind of 2 aha moments. There were certainly a lot more, but those were 2 that were pretty dramatic in my mind.
Yeah, thank you. I actually want to continue with this kind of this line of questions and sharing experiences. You wrote a book about road schooling, and your book was about integrating the travel and everything around you into the actual education. Can you talk a little bit about what the premise is of that book, and then maybe share a couple examples of how that looked in your family's travels?
The whole premise of my book is that ultimately, it doesn't matter what kids learn, it just matters that they learn. And a lot of parents have this idea that the schools have created this scientifically developed curriculum that is designed to make sure that every kid knows what they need to know in order to be successful adults. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Speaking as a teacher, there is nothing wrong with the curriculum that the schools have. There's nothing wrong with learning about dinosaurs and learning about the five senses and learning about the parts of the flower, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. But none of that is essential. Kids need to learn how to read, they need to learn how to write, they need to learn how to manipulate numbers, but the content that they use to learn those skills, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you learn about the phases of the moon or the parts of a flower, that stuff doesn't matter. So one of the things that drives me crazy is when parents would write to me, and I would get emails all the time, and parents would write and say, we're going to take our kid out and go travel for a year. What curriculum should we take with us? And my response is, are you kidding me? You are telling me that you're going to go to the Panama Canal, and while you've got the Panama Canal 10 miles away, you're going to sit in your hotel and you're going to open up your book. Okay, well, it's Tuesday. That means we're doing page 56, and that means you've got to learn about the American Civil War today. Excuse me, use what you have. You're there. Use that as the basis of your children's education. So by that, I mean, when we were arriving at the Panama Canal, we spent some time researching the history of the canal, the making of the canal. It was a whole lot harder to make than I ever dreamed of. We learned about the physics involved with raising and lowering the ships. We learned about the economic aspect of cutting a week off of the journey and what a dramatic effect that was on shipping companies. I mean, number one, their ships are tied up. They can make that many more trips because it's taking a week less, but they weren't losing as many ships because going around the southern tip of South America is one of the most dangerous places for ships. So all of a sudden, the economic impact of the Panama Canal was huge. We looked at the ecological aspect of what happens if you connect the two oceans, because the original plan was to just simply connect them, just to have an open canal. And then they ended up coming up with the idea of the locks, and they raised the ships up and lowered them down. But what would have happened? What would have been the effect if we had actually connected the two oceans? So we looked at all of that kind of stuff. I know when we were there, when we were at Machu Picchu, of course, we were studying about ruins in general. We were studying about Machu Picchu specific. So wherever we were learning about the tradition, the culture, the whatever it was that was there. And of course, that varied tremendously. When we were up in the Arctic tundra in Alaska, we learned about the Arctic grasses and about how they are absolutely remarkable. I had no idea that these Arctic grasses were as cool as they are. There is so much involved with this tundra and the grasslands. And so we learned about those grasses and what made them special. So, it was wherever we were, that's what we were learning about. On the down in southern Argentina, we happened to stop into this little town that used to be the staging grounds for the Argentine army during the Falklands War. Well, of course, we're going to learn about the Falklands War. It's like, sure, we're here. Let's take advantage of this. We're here. Let's talk with people. And of course, that was very recent history. And so the Argentine people were very passionate about that. But the amazing thing was we were actually there with another cyclist who was British. And so we had this British perspective and we had the Argentine perspective. So, in the grand scheme of things, is it imperative that our sons learn about the Falklands War? No. But by understanding the Falklands War and understanding the two sides and the conflict and how that all developed, you understand so much more than just the Falklands War. So that's the whole idea that I have about how to take advantage of your travels as the basis for your children's education. And I personally, I would never recommend that somebody take an actual curriculum with them as they're traveling. You've got the world, and that is the most amazing curriculum you'll ever find.
Amazing. And that is spoken from a teacher. So I am so grateful that you said that. We identify with being world schoolers. And what makes that slightly different than being an unschooler is, as an unschooler, we pursue what we're interested in. My son guides his education based on his specific interests. But as a world schooler, the added element is we've got the world around us to inspire us, and all of these new things really create interest in areas that we may not have had an interest in before. And as Greg said, he was saying, oh, I just lost it. Oh, goodness. Actually, I want to jump over to Greg and ask you about some of your world schooling experiences, if you can share that. And if I get this thought back in my head, I'll come back in and ask.
No, I think Nancy's examples there are really great about, that's a great world school experience. And one of the things that I find so important, it's kind of been touched on a little bit, is that learning as a whole. And there's an excellent book called Dumbing Us Down that I really like that book. And he said one of the big problems with the system is that it tries so hard to divide everything, divide it up and say, oh, no, math here. Don't bring up your science questions. This is math. And then the bell rings and you're like, no, but I still want to learn. No. Now you're switching to this subject. And separating it. And Nancy was illustrating so well there. You go to have an experience and all of a sudden you're hitting economics and you're hitting science and you're hitting math and you're hitting social studies and history. And it's so wonderful. You know, with our children, our oldest ones now, their Spanish is getting really great. And it's just so fun to have them make those connections now with languages. And then even something as simple as a trip down to the coast. We go down, we stop, we talk in some markets, we spend time there, let them practice and learn their skills with Spanish and shopping or whatever, and personal finance. And then we stopped and visited a young widow who had lost her husband, and she and her 3 boys were living on $50 a month. And we took our children over there and we helped set up kind of help her to be more self-reliant, help her to set up a little business that can help increase your income. And so they're in there and they're learning, again, economics and finance and social skills. And then the science, and Costa Rica particularly is just surrounded with so many animals and plants and so much beauty and geography. So the learning has to be across the spectrum, and that's what makes it great. And that's what makes it exciting. And you don't have to divide it up and separate it. It can all come together. And again, I keep coming back to this whole person and the whole idea of experiencing, each of the elements, from mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and social, and have it all together, experiencing that in each level and learning and growing. It just makes for a wonderful, wonderful life and education. It really does. Not just academic, but on that whole level.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And Raynor, actually, I want to pop back over to you and ask you to share some of your experiences that demonstrate the immersive learning.
Oh, geez. Where to begin? You know what? I'm going to, just because I don't have a really good answer right off the top of my head, I do want to make if you don't mind, just a suggestion for people listening, because, you've got 4 of us here who are very experienced in the world of travel, and particularly with our children, and the experiences are too many to count type of thing. And I can understand and appreciate how not everyone can necessarily relate to this type of thing. So if you don't mind, I want to just take a moment, because I know we're nearing the end, to give some advice that I hope could be helpful for people listening. And I'm sure we've all done this in our own way with our children as we travel. And that is to give them the opportunity to call the shots. Get them involved in the planning. Ask them, hey, and even if it's not for a long trip, even if it's for a weekend getaway or a day trip, ask them like, hey, let's take a trip as a family. Where do you want to go? Is there anything that would interest you? And I guarantee you that if they get a chance to make the decision or be part of that process, that they will be interested and engaged. And because that's the whole key is, and I think Greg has touched on this a number of times, that, I think he looks at kind of engaging his kids in this way. What can the end game be? Get them involved. I think a lot of parents don't do that. They're like, all right, they kind of, in an almost classic way, throw the kids in the back of the car and say, all right, we're going here and there and there and here, and the kids are just kind of along for the ride. Make sure to get the kids interested and engaged and get them to be part of the planning process. And again, I think we've all touched on this, but, travel is just, the act of, I don't want to give the literal definition, but, in our purposes here, it's really getting to places with different experiences than you usually have in your day-to-day life or from your common everyday surroundings. And giving the kids the opportunity to do that can and will change their life if you allow them to. So get them involved.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what you were talking about letting kids make these decisions, because ultimately, what is our goal as parents? Our goal is to help our kids develop the thinking and the problem-solving skills that will carry them through life. And it is those decisions, step by step, itty-bitty decisions, that empower them to start to make bigger and bigger decisions. So by letting them choose, where they're going to go, here, give you a map and say, where do you want to go? That is then empowering the kids to do so much, and yeah, give those kids, even starting when they're really young, as much autonomy as you can in making decisions. Understand that sometimes you're going to have to step in and say, you know what, that decision is not going to be a very good decision. That one, the effects are not there. I'm not willing to go there. But if you can, certainly do it. And all of that ultimately then leads to that independence, which is what we all want for our kids. And I actually just last night had a situation where I realized that we had nailed that one. Talking about those aha moments. My sons went to the robotics, down to the shop to work on building their robot. And when they were leaving the shop, Daryl got a flat tire. And so Davey came home, a while later, and he came in the house and he said, Daryl had a flat tire. I told him to just go ahead and go back to the shop, and I would ride home, and I'll get the car, and then I'll go pick him up again. And I thought, you know what? That's not how I would have solved the problem. I would have just gone and called us and had us drive down there or whatever. But that was Davey had taken charge. The kids had taken charge. They had made this decision that Davey was going to go ahead and ride his bike home, get the car, drive back, and pick up his brother. And I thought, that's ultimately what we're looking at. And all of that happens by little decisions. Let kids make little decisions when they're little, and as they get older, they're able to make more and more and more important decisions, which ultimately will lead to wise adults, which is what we really want. We want our world to be populated by wise adults, and it's allowing them to make those decisions at a younger age that will lead to that.
Indeed, Nancy. And one of the things that we incorporated into our travel and our travel planning was budget sharing. So we knew what the budget was. What do we want to do next? Here, Miro, you go plan, this month. Here's the budget. Here's what we can do. Here's what we have to work with. And I think giving kids, the responsibility of planning from a budget covers all these other, academic subjects that we don't break life into. But if you need to prove that you've done economics and math and, real world decision making, you can do it, with those circumstances. So I think all of these are incredible illustrations of how to not only grow a strong family, but learn from the travels and, give our kids the opportunities that we all want. I did remember what I was going to say about what Greg mentioned. Greg, you mentioned earlier that travel gave you the experience of being alive. And I love that so much. I wanted to comment on that. For us, travel gave us the experience of being present, and that was an incredible gift. And I think so many people forget to live their lives when they're back in a conventional life. They get caught up in everything. So there's something to be said about that. So if anybody else wants to comment on that, let's go ahead and do that now. And then we're going to go around and everybody in the panel is going to share what their projects are. And unfortunately, our show is coming to an end. So Nancy, would you like to comment on what travel gives you?
Indeed. I actually, shortly after we finished our journey, so we had spent a year on the road, then a year back home, and then 3 years on the road. And we came back here to Boise, and I remember there was just this huge void in my life. I didn't know. For so many years, I had been focused on Ushuaia. I had been focused on that southern tip of South America. I had a goal. I knew where I was going. And all of a sudden, I didn't have that. And I didn't know what I wanted. And I was just really confused for a few months. And I finally realized, I had this aha moment one day where I realized that ultimately it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're traveling or if you are stationary. What's important is that you wake up every morning and you look at the 24 hours that you have ahead of you and you say, what I am going to do with these 24 hours is what I choose to do with these 24 hours. Nobody is making me do this. I'm not being forced. This is my choice. I am here because it's my choice. And if at any point in time this is not meeting my needs, then I will go elsewhere. And we've now been in Boise nearly 4 years now, and I love it. I have to say, I absolutely love it here. I used to say that when I was traveling, I was more alive or I was more present or whatever, because when you're traveling, it kind of forces you to be present or to focus on today, because tomorrow you're going to be somewhere else. And so you kind of have to focus on today. The same thing can happen when you are living in one place. It is a conscious decision that we make. I can feel like I'm trapped here. And if I feel like I'm trapped, then I am. Or I can look at it and say, I am making this choice. And for now, I'm here in Boise, and I'm loving being here in Boise. And if at any point in time, Boise is no longer meeting our needs as a family, then we'll go elsewhere. But until that happens, here we are. And I think that's really important about living and being present and being right here, right now.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much for that. And Rainer, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think, we went from kind of 1 year of untraditional schooling, if you will, back into the traditional. And, even for that 1 year, we thought it was perfectly fine to go against the grain. And I think most people, and I've met since a lot of people who have gone against the grain when it comes not only to education, but to travel in general. And these are pretty unique, fascinating, well-rounded people who have made it a priority to live life on their terms. So again, I've referenced it a few times, but I suspect that the audience that's listening, if they are in fact choosing to school their children in a non-traditional way, would certainly be accepting of things that are typically non-traditional in other areas of their lives. And for those that choose to travel, and to travel more than just during your 2-week vacation time, they're seeking something different and something unique and transformative. So one of the projects that I'm working on, I work with an organization called Meet, Plan, Go. Meet, Plan, Go. And this organization It's really kind of a grassroots community network of people who are interested in taking career breaks, specifically to travel. And there are those that have children, there are those that don't. They're singles, they're couples, they're old, they're young. But people do need encouragement sometimes. And just like this community needs encouragement and advice and resources on this kind of non-traditional schooling, people feel the same way about travel. And I'm part of that group called Meet, Plan, Go. So if anyone here in Cyberland thinks that's an interesting thing, look up Meet, Plan, Go on the internet. Google it, and you'll get more information. But it's again, if you're looking for things that are a little bit off the beaten path, that's one of them. So.
And Rena, we're actually going to wrap up in just a moment, but before we do, go ahead and give us your information about your project real fast, and then we'll go the rest of the panel.
I recently, last fall, set up a new association within the travel industry called the Family Travel Association, and our goal is pretty simple. We're bringing together the best resources, experts and suppliers, if you will, in the travel industry, all focused on family travel. And our goal is to inspire families to travel more. We want to advocate that travel be a part of every child's education. And we want to put all those resources and expertise and information all in one place, because right now it exists. It's kind of scattered all over the web. But effective really kind of mid-March, you'll see on familytravel.org information, hopefully everything you need to know and want to know about family travel, both in terms of education and just pure recreation. That's where the new home will be.
Thank you for doing that for this community. It's such a great resource, and we need to have that there. Thank you, Rena, for being on our panel tonight.
Thank you, Lainey. You did a fantastic job gathering this great group.
Oh, what an incredible group. And Greg, I'd like to give you the opportunity to answer the last question. If there was, any final words about, I brought up your feeling alive and the aha moments and the being present. If there's anything you want to add to that. And then also, Greg, give us your contact information, and everything's going to be linked on the show notes page on the Conscious Consumer Network and on our website as well. So, floor is yours.
Awesome. No, my last thought, I was sitting here excited, just listening, just getting more excited about it. Just sometimes you wake up and just like, man, I can't believe this is awesome. What a great life. So many great opportunities to live wherever you are. Like Nancy's saying, you choose to live, and you get to choose the way you want to live. And just so, I guess my last message is get out and live your life, and live it deliberately and purposely and really present, but be excited about it. And that's what we're creating or have been doing. I do educational mentoring, and my site's gregdenning.com, and I do my mentoring through there and speaking. But we're creating and have created worldschoolacademy.com, and it's just creating resources for families wherever they are in the world to have resources to really take. You choose your own educational path. And wherever it be. So we met so many families that they come out, they want to travel or they want to live abroad, but maybe the schools aren't that good, or the private schools are very expensive. They just don't know how to put it together to make a really great plan to get a world-class education. And so that's what we've been working on. We're passionate about it. We're excited about it. Just want to help families, get out, travel, learn, grow, and have it as a family, grow and learn and really get a great education to live the life they dream. It sounds cliche, but live the life you love and live the life you dream of, and make it happen and make it great.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Greg, for being on the panel. I'm really, really excited. This is the first time we've ever spoke. So we've been connected on social media, and it's been such an honor having you here. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Finally, let's move to back over to Nancy. And Nancy, can you give out your social contacts and your projects and your book information and such?
Yeah, my goal at this point is very similar to Greg's, the idea of empowering parents. There are so many parents who want to go and take a year off and go travel, but they are afraid. They're afraid of the education. They're afraid that their kids' education is going to suffer. And so my book is called Road Schooling, The Ultimate Guide to Education Through Travel, the idea of using your travel experiences as the basis of your children's education. And I am available for personal coaching to help walk people through, help them understand how to take advantage of those travels in a way that they can be confident that their children will not have to skip a grade at school or whatever, that they will be able to come back and their kids will be able to integrate back into the schools if that's what they so choose. And my website is familyonbikes.org. I've got links to the books on Family on Bikes. And that's where I'm at.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for being on this panel too. Last time I interviewed you, we just discovered it was 4 years ago, which blows me away. But you've been committed to this cause for a long time, and I see you out there supporting people, and I'm so thrilled. And this has been an honor. We could probably talk for 2 more hours with this panel. There's so much more that we could talk about. But unfortunately, we have to end this show tonight, but it's been an incredible panel, and I'd love to have all of you back again on a future panel. So for now, I just wanted to say, wherever you are, whatever you're doing in the world, continue to do it for the love of learning. So thank you and good night, everybody.